Welcome to AGNT, the podcast for enterprise tech meets the Agentic era. I'm Gemma Allen, joined by my co-host Raphael Dornano, broadcasting from the New York Stock Exchange. On every episode, we unpack how intelligent systems are reshaping companies, markets, and the way real work gets done. From Fortune 500 boardrooms to breakout upstarts, we're digging into the strategies, technologies, and people defining the next chapter of AI. Let's get into it. So Raphael, welcome back to the NYSE and theCUBE. What a week in Paris last week.
What a week.
But also, what a week right here on Wall Street. Even today, what a day on the markets, right? Let's start with your commentary from your Substack this week around SpaceX. The $22.7 trillion conundrum, would you call it?
Black hole.
Quagmire. So, let's break this down, right? I think the core of what you have been saying is that the market has evaluated SpaceX on one space. Right now, the rubber is meeting the road on another, right? Enterprise applications, that proof point hasn't really been realized yet for SpaceX. Cursor may or may not change that. Let's see what is to happen there. But really, right now, it is still fundamentally a data center, metal chips infrastructure play, right? What are your thoughts based on everything that's happened since this company went public? Like, are you still very hell-bent on your original thesis?
Well, look, again, I think that SpaceX is a great business. SpaceX is three different businesses together, like not one business, and I've chosen to focus really on the AI part. And what was very intriguing, to not say shocking, in the S1 was the weight of the TAM of what they call enterprise applications in the AI space. So enterprise applications, when I think of enterprise applications, I think of Microsoft, I think of Salesforce, I think of Anthropic and the coding wedge, etc. And here you have a 22.7 trillion, that's a big number for this TAM. And then you look at the S1 and you're like, oh, I have no details whatsoever that allows me to understand what is behind that. So this was when the company went public. Now we have just reached the end of what we call the quiet period, the time during which analysts cannot publish. And at the beginning of last week, we had a flurry of research reports that came out. So I was looking to have an answer to my question, where is the value behind this gigantic TAM? And how surprised was I when I looked at in all of the research, everyone is underwriting SpaceX AI on compute, on the infrastructure play. Reasoning in terms of gigawatts, etc., which is right for the infrastructure business, but to my best knowledge, which is not how you underwrite like an enterprise application, which is the biggest TAM by far per their own declarations. So I'm quite surprised that we have this massive black hole, to take the term I use, where how on earth does this company justify where it gets to? I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, that it will never get there. I'm saying, as an investor, I just need a bit of explanation on how to think about that option value. So what happened last week is we had the Grok 4.5 model that was released. Very powerful model, not the same as Anthropic, Fable, etc., but still very powerful. We had a preview of the Sand agent from Cursor, their big acquisition. And so I'm just thinking that, okay, here we have SpaceX that is following Anthropic's playbook with maybe different attributes because Cursor gives them a very strong wedge into the enterprise. And I'm just trying to figure out how this breaks out. I think it's interesting.
If we look at Cursor for a second as a core competitive advantage that they didn't have 6 months ago, right?
Right.
It is in some respects following that Anthropic playbook, because what Anthropic did was first they won the development audience, right? They had Claude Code, it built enterprise applications, it sped up development cycles, like, you know, with the speed of sound. People were blown away by what it could produce. And then additional workforce, enterprise tasks followed, or I would say are following, right? Because I think that part of enterprise, whether or not we really are seeing huge agentic replacement, is not really clear, right? But the Anthropic approach certainly seems to be somewhat of a proven, convincing approach to win enterprise over. Does Cursor really offer that from the perspective of offering anything that's technically better, technically new, or is it again just going to become somewhat of a personality contest in the decisions that frame what LLM or what company you align yourself with at an enterprise level? And again, does that bring it all back to this whole view, right or wrong, that a lot of people didn't actually bet on SpaceX, they bet on Musk?
Well, you can bet on Musk, and again, I like the person a lot, but like we're talking about like lots of money here. Like we're talking about a company that is worth $2 trillion when in my research I put it at 950 billion. So it's by any means it's like the value of like it's 5 times the value of IBM. Like the difference, like IBM is worth 200 billion. It's like 5 times the difference of IBM just in that difference. So we're not talking about small numbers. I think what Anthropic did and what Anthropic is doing is they cracked what I have termed the coding wedge. And they did that even before Cloud Code. They really went into, if I win the developers and if I am able to use coding as like the verification ground, because coding, it's right or it's wrong, that's going to be like a perfect Trojan horse into the enterprise. Then they built Cloud Code, which grew massively in ARR. Then they built Cloud Cowork, the whole agentic system on top, like with the managed agents, etc. Okay, so they're orchestrating that playbook right now, and we need to understand how that plays out in the general enterprise. That's work in progress. SpaceX is coming from a wedge, which is also the coding wedge, which is multimodal with Cursor, not just one model. So they have a neutrality that is actually very interesting. They have a proximity to user intent, which is one of the key points in my framework that I think is very strong in their case. So they're actually starting from a position that is perhaps even more interesting than the position of Anthropic, with a model that is very good. It's not an very good, and so very good, very cheap, and with unlimited infrastructure. If you take a step back, maybe they're not as good as Fable. Okay, acknowledge that. But they have those two other attributes that combine with almost frontier, way cheaper, in a context of open source like discussion. Like we can talk about that, like that's the massive debate right now, open source.
Let's just stay on Cursor for a second and the fact that it's multimodal, right? Because the other thing that Anthropic built when they were building Cloud Code and building out all of these enterprise ops is they built a lot of trust at enterprise level,
right,
and a lot of really strong narrative, right? I covered AWS in Washington, D.C. and New York since we last spoke. And one thing became clear is like everyone can agree that Anthropic has done a phenomenal job at marketing. Okay,
phenomenal.
Like they really have. I mean, the brand, and I spoke to some folks at OpenAI who, I think it's hard to debate that, right? They are really, really good. When we think about multimodal from the perspective of Cursor, again, under this SpaceX ownership though, right? How true, do you think that will be 3 years from now? Because we know one thing about Elon Musk as well is that he's almost competitive to a insanity level, right? So again, is that, you think, a consistent play? Do you imagine that will continue? And do you think that could actually win hearts and minds of enterprise when truly they still are buying a SpaceX product?
Well, look, I think you're raising a super interesting point, which is really at the heart of this debate. It's first, we are at the very beginning of this whole agentic AI build out. And I repeat always the same point, which is cost doesn't matter when you're just doing pilots and you're just starting. Okay, as we were in right now, except for all of the token maxing, etc. But when you start to really have an agentic enterprise, and when you start transforming JP Morgan, Chubb, FedEx, DHL, whatever, into a true agentic enterprise with LLMs at the core of every single workflow, then you have a massive question of what is this going to cost me as an enterprise? This is where the question gets really critical. And so when you have a model that is almost as good, not perfect, but almost as good, much cheaper, not to the level of open source, but still, that question becomes like a very strong competitive advantage. Number one, when you say, I have the ability to go beyond this compute wall, and with the infrastructure on Earth and in space that I'm building as Elon, which prevents me from having like higher cost of compute, and at least which allows me to actually have unlimited compute, which is a key moat in this era. All of a sudden you start from a position where you don't have the narrative of trust, you don't have the narrative of the enterprise, and you're right to say that that Anthropic has done an excellent job at that. You know, the hallucination rate of Grok 4.5, I think it's 54%. So it's actually gone up versus the prior models. So I would say this is all a question of balance. What is interesting with these LLM companies is that they're all starting from very different points. They're converging into, we need to win the enterprise AI game. I think everyone is converging on that. Even OpenAI, which was at first, remember, in the consumer space, like even though they're announcing now a new consumer play,
and they are making traction.
And they are making traction. Codex is amazing and all that. I think the battleground, and it's the same thing for the enterprise SaaS incumbents, for the Microsoft, the Salesforce, it's the same thing for Databricks. Everyone is wanting to win this playground of the agentic enterprise. And so everyone is coming from a different perspective. It's too early to see who's going to win, and things can change very fast, I think. We're seeing that with the open source inflection point. Look at the massive interest in Chinese open source. Remember, we talked about this on the show a couple of months ago. Oh, really? Can we have Chinese open source? I'm not sure. Now everyone is talking about Chinese open source, like in all the conversations, and maybe it's going to be banned. How do we manage that? So I think there's been a change. I think it's interesting to see what is the starting point, what is the end game, and to track in a very rigorous way how they're actually moving, each in a different way along that same route.
Well, let's talk about another point you made earlier, which is about cost, right? And about the cost advantage, because we hear a lot about tokenomics. We hear a lot about cost control, about the changing challenges of a CFO who has to think like a CTO in this environment we're in, right? Because predictability has become somewhat of a rarity when it comes to OpEx for tech, right? For tech spend. How much, again, and maybe just to put you on the spot here, but how much cheaper is the SpaceX/Cursor model? But also, how much do you think cost really plays into it from the perspective of cost versus trust versus narrative?
Well, first, I would say there's an interesting debate that is, not a debate, but at least a consideration that is becoming central, which is the cost per token is different than the cost per task. And this is all a question of architectural, agentic engineering. You can have a token that is going to cost, let's say, 10 times less, but if the way it's infrastructure, the way it actually works, that could be only 2 times cheaper. So we're starting to diverge from a token cost is not this absolute criteria. It's what the cost, the task costs in the end. So it can be we're talking about 5 times or 10 times difference in certain cases. So it's not marginal difference. So I think that's number one. I'm sure it's a massive point of consideration that we are only starting to understand. Because once again, when you have pilots at only 1% of your enterprise that is agentic, which I would say is the truth. Who said that? I'm trying to... Yes, Ken Griffin from Citadel said something interesting this week. He said in all of the conversations that he had with CEOs who were saying that they were implementing AI, it was actually not really AI. It was digital, a bit of AI, but not agentic AI. So why am I saying that? The agentic AI enterprise is at the very, very early innings. So no one has any idea of the true cost. And someone who says that they have, is lying, I can guarantee you. So we are only starting to understand what is going to be the biggest cost structure on any P&L of any company within the S&P 500 over the next 3 to 5 years. And of course, that is going to be a massive debate.
So it's interesting when we think about the term enterprise, because in some respects, for a conversation like this, or for any conversation right now, that's too broad, right? Because if you're an enterprise buyer, let's say you're a large bank, you are Citadel, right? You
Right?
are probably buying a lot of infrastructure and technology for on-prem deployment, right? Which again changes some of the buyer decision makings for certain for certain layers of that stack. You're probably not going to buy an open weight model. Obviously, if you're going to have something that's completely sovereign and on-prem, you're going to buy something that's super tight, like perhaps an Anthropic or maybe an OpenAI or whatever, or a Gemini, right? Depending on where your
Right.
integrations already are. So when we think about the world of enterprise and who's going to cut their cloth in separate spaces, there is also like an alignment to what the solution you're building for looks like, right? And I think the world of sovereign AI, companies that are building solutions that are very controlled, where they own the control plane, where everything is built on premise, is becoming more and more and more of what we're hearing, right? Especially from the perspective of large scale institutions, which was or is where a lot of these huge fast growth companies want to land the stickiness initially.
Right.
So how do you think about that from the perspective of classifying that market and that TAM as we see that split, that wedge kind of deepen between what was public cloud versus of old versus what is now something that's very much owned and managed either in-house or at least exceptionally securely, even versus 10 years ago?
Well, 1 year ago, I had written an article called The Agentic Cloud. And this was when we were just starting to talk about agentic orchestration in May 2025, saying as agentic AI becomes predominant and we have this orchestration of agentic workflows, the cloud and its function is going to change. And I had said at that time that I saw that the hyperscalers were actually in a much better position than the neoclouds because of what they were building to actually make this new kind of cloud able to deal with the cost, with the latency required by agentic AI workloads. I had pointed out a company called Daytona AI, super great startup that has been very active in this field since then, saying this is not the cloud that we had in the previous period. This is a new kind of cloud in which I think the hyperscalers actually can win this game. Now, the move to the edge, where a lot of workloads are happening, maybe on this computer, maybe on a cell phone, we're not there yet. Like, people are overestimating where we are right now, but it's a trend for sure. And it's a trend more and more combined with open source models. So right now you have like this trend of open source combined with the move to the edge. It's changing again how we think about the environments in which we deploy agentic AI. And the answer is going to be a combination of both. You're going to have super smart devices at the edge that are going to be where you express your intent on your phone, on like a clock in a hospital, whatever. And the cloud that is going to, in my view, continue to play a predominant role. Now, back to your question of the sovereignty and who owns the data. I think what I've seen in recent days, and this is, I think, quite recent, is one of the critical questions that is emerging in agentic AI in terms of moats is who owns the agentic memory? Who owns the memory of actually running agentic workflows, of making good decisions, of making mistakes, of having something work perfectly on time or something fail completely and cost you way too many tokens? And where does those agentic traces, that agentic memory go? Does it go to the labs? Does it go to the lakehouse? Does it go to the hyperscalers? To the enterprise software companies? That is going to be, in my view, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in future conversations, I'm seeing that emerge as perhaps the most critical question of the next weeks or months. Where does agentic memory go and who owns that?
I mean, that is a fascinating concept to think through, right? On the topic of memory, though, let's stay there for a second. One thing that has become quite clear this year to me as I watch this market evolve and talk to investors and founders and leaders is that the very unsexy side of tech, the part of tech that no one really cared about, 5 years ago, that, again, has had a lot of, legacy success, but has never been seen as cool or exciting, or 21-year-olds jumping at the bite to work in, right, has suddenly become extremely attractive from the perspective of financial opportunity and and runway for TAM, right?
Sure.
Memory is a perfect example of that. Companies like Solidigm, Weka, these guys who suddenly have a TAM that's at least 5 to 10 years in predictable outcome. And it's hard to dispute that, right? I don't think they could have said that 2 years ago. And when we think about this and these spaces, it makes me think, like, what other parts of this tech stack are somewhat undiscovered, unknown, or unhyped that also offer huge advantage? You know, because if you think about it, 3 years ago, nobody was really talking about these companies, right? So, like, I keep thinking, like, what else is going to crawl out of the woodwork here? Like, what else are we missing from the perspective of opportunity to feed this craze?
Right.
That we maybe haven't thought about? Like, do you have any thoughts about other areas that you research or, you know, analyze or have conversations about, other, again, more boring parts of this ecosystem?
Well, I'm not going to tell you my secrets because that's a big part of, like, I mean, investing, being early on in some of those memory names. And so here we're not talking about like agentic memory as I was discussing earlier, but more like the actual hardware memory, like to make agentic AI possible, which is a different kind of memory. Like, those names have been like on a ride, like SanDisk, like of course Micron, SK Hynix. That, I mean, we had the IPO last week. I mean, we haven't even talked about it. This was like a major IPO, huge IPO here on the Nasdaq last week. So that theme has emerged as critical. I think what we're seeing here as an inflection point is that memory is not just a cyclical hardware component. It's something that is super structural in the agentic AI build out, with price increases that are mind blowing, like order books that are full, and that are continuing in that direction. I think that the whole agentic AI, like, again, paradigm is creating new parts of the hardware stack across all of the stack, networking, like opticals, memory, semi-cap, that are very new, and a lot of those aspects, and this is across Asia, Europe, the US, it's fascinating.
Wow. Okay, well, Raphael, maybe I'll have to get you a couple of glasses of wine and see if I can drag some of those secrets out of you.
Try.
I can be richer 5 years from now. But listen, fascinating conversation. I know we have to wrap, but what are you focused on for the next week or two? I know you look at a lot of earnings. July tends to be a quieter time for most companies, but who are you watching and what are you staying close to?
Well, I think I'm very focused right now on, again, semis versus software. I do not believe, like, we had a rotation at the beginning of the month where everyone was exiting semis, going back into software. My views on software are the SaaS apocalypse is not over. It's not a SaaS apocalypse anymore, except for IBM. It's more like a mutation of some of the winners, big winners, some of the big losers that are really starting to emerge. And on the semis, it's more understanding, like, what is really here to stay and to drive value over the long term versus what was just like something cyclical that can just go in and out, where it's not where you want to invest. So I do not agree with the market's view on, like, this thing is there's an inversion. I stick to what I was thinking before. So I'm working on refining the thesis around that and getting all of the data points on this thesis.
Well, I love it. I think it's a world and a time where constant refinement and constant reconsideration is happening at a pace that we've never known before. So, Raphael Giordano, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And that's a wrap for this week's episode of AGNT. Tune in next time we continue to break down the future of the agentic economy.